this is the presentation. Like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about it at our advisor year-end work days. That said, there's some really good information in here relating to other collections. So this presentation is going to talk about what's staying the same year over year when it comes to your year-end 22-23 reporting. We'll talk a little bit about staff, a little bit about consolidated data collection, CDC, and then a big chunk of our time will be spent talking about advisor. We'll talk through some updates that occurred this year that were changes year over year about staff and advisor. And then I'll also go through some stuff that's coming soon next year for 23-24 advisor. At this time, there's no massive changes proposed for staff reporting or CDC, so there's not really much to share with you. And then there's, like I said, some great resources. So the things that are staying the same when it comes to your year-end reporting for the 22-23 school year: staff reporting still due June 15th with an audit window of the 30th. We still have that secondary collection and NSSRS validation where you can check your errors and your reports. And then also the third collection, NDE staff ID, which is a great resource if you need to look up staff ID numbers. The consolidated data collections, we have several open right now. Those still are due June 15th with an audit window through the 30th. And then the advisor validation collection still has your errors, warnings, lookups, and verification reports. So I'm going to dig into each of these a little bit more thoroughly here. So we'll start with staff reporting. We've got a link to the staff manual, which is a really great resource if you're not sure, like if you need to have a definition for one of the data elements that's collected in there. I also want to make sure to highlight here that after June 30th, we can't make changes to staff reporting data. So it's so important that schools and districts are going through and looking at their year-end collections here in staff reporting specifically. Kind of talk through these kind of year-end updates, right? Because you put everything in at the beginning of the year, but maybe at the end of the year, you have to add a completion date for a staff person who left midway through the year. You know, the substitute days worked. You're going to want to make sure that those are totaled and tabulated for the end of the year. And then just making sure that when you're in the staff reporting collection, all your staff are listed as green and there's no errors within the collection itself. A couple helpful, useful tools. I talked about the NDE staff ID collection where you can look up and create staff IDs. And then also the CERT lookup site can be really helpful if you're trying to see how someone is endorsed, if they're certified, when their CERT expires, and that's this link here. Then the other collection that's related to staff reporting is the NSSRS validation collection. So you've got staff reporting done, you've made your updates. Next day, go into NSSRS validation. Take a look at the errors that are there. This collection allows us to take the data you reported in staff reporting and kind of compare it to different systems, whether it be, you know, certification, any of this kind of stuff. So we'll have some errors that are important to review there. And then there's a bunch of verification reports specific to staff data that can also be really helpful. Maybe even printing a current personnel report for the end of the year. So you know, okay, end of this year, this is what we reported. This is the data we've got there. So I won't go through all these reports, but it's important to kind of review some of those as part of your year-end process when it comes to staff reporting. Next, we'll talk a little bit about consolidated data collections, the CDC. So we've got a resource page here. It lists all the instructions for every collection within the CDC, so that can be helpful. I already talked about that the data is due on June 15th. The owners of these collections will contact you if they haven't seen completed it, if they need some updates made in that audit window, and then the collections close on June 30th. So a few of the collections that are within the CDC that are due at the year end. We've got the Human Resources Director contacts. This has been open all year, but it's important that you update that so the CERT team knows who to contact when it comes to HR stuff. We've got the days in session instructional program hours collection. Max mentioned that earlier. There is, if you are short on hours, there's an affidavit for instructional hour exception. And this is a web link to our bulletin where they shared a bulletin recently about how to submit that if you think you're going to be short on those program hours. Now, this is specifically to publics, right? Only publics have to complete the instructional program hours. But if we've got some non-publics, they also have to do the days and sessions. So depending on the type of system you are is the data that you submit in that collection. We've got the Nebraska Education Profile, or the NEP information collection in the CDC, that's due. The annual participation report for our federal programs team, pupil transportation report for the finance folks, the ESU district system school information report that Max talked about. Put a link in here to the pre-recorded presentation if you want a little more information on that. And then the optional collections that are request to submit data later, make data changes, and the grad cohort resolution requests. So those are CDC collections open year round if you need them. All right, so now let's get into advisor validation. You're getting ready to look at your urine and review everything. So the data that we're collecting at the end of the year includes your demographic information, enrollment, your completers, your graduates, attendance data, discipline, courses, including that instructional time plan Max spent a lot of time talking about, grades, all these various programs. We've got SPED, early childhood, Rule 18. We've got the 21-22 Perkins 5 post-school survey, and we've got SPED post-school outcomes data that you're going to want to review as well as part of that process. This link here takes you to the advisor validation calendar where we kind of break all that out and we say what we're using the various data for. So I'm going to list that out here a little bit on this slide. The reason we collect this data at the end of the year: data aid calculations, NEP information. The SPED information is huge because we use that for both state and federal reporting. We've got AQuest, statewide assessment, cohort. There's lots of reasons that we're collecting this information. So I'll kind of let you read through this, but this is again also in that calendar, but it's really helpful to see and understand the why we're collecting this information at the end of the year. Okay, so a couple things to highlight about advisor validation that are the same year over year. This 21-22 Perkins 5 post-school survey, this data is collected now, but it's actually relating to last year's advisor data. So you're going to actually change your school year in advisor validation to 21-22, and then you're going to go to these verification reports here and review the data to make sure that it's accurate. Similar thing can be said for the SPED post-school outcomes, excuse me. Last year's SPED exiters, a survey was sent to them literally just earlier this month, or it is in the process of being. The data was pulled recently. So now when you're looking at 22-23 and you're starting to report some of those SPED exiters, you want to make sure that the information that they need to do this survey, address, et cetera, is in advisor validation for these kiddos, because then next spring, we pull this information from the 22-23 database and we send the survey information that way. There is a change year over year in that for the 21-22 SPED exiters, the survey we just sent, the ages were 14 plus, or 16 plus, excuse me. Next year, the age is going to be 14 plus. So it's going to include a few more kiddos in the survey next year. All right, so you're in advisor validation. You're like, where do I begin? I'm just starting. Start with your errors and warnings. I've highlighted a few of the sections here that are data sets and some of the errors that we see that are more critical, ones that you really want to pay attention to, because what you want to do is you want to get your information in advisor validation, and then you want to see kind of what doesn't match, and that's what these error warnings are telling you. So for demographics information, you may have demographics information missing for a student who has an enrollment record in advisor, but it's missing that demographic data. Well, we can't use that unless we have the full set. Potentially no race reported for the student. That's required data in order for us to do a lot of our reports. When it comes to enrollment, maybe no current school enrollment record exists for a kiddo that was enrolled last year. What happened to this kid? We haven't seen anything in advisor that indicates that this kiddo has been exited, transferred out, whatever. So we want to make sure that you're reporting that now, because last year there was no exit information. Another enrollment error we see a lot is a student in grades K through 8 without an enrollment record. Exit code, same thing, who do not appear in the following school year. There are some course errors and warnings. This one is a new one this year, so that's why we're highlighting it. Max talked about it a lot during his presentation. High school course with no planned instructional time reported. Now, this is a warning. It's not a critical error, because it's one of those warnings or errors that we're saying, hey, you sent us this data. It looks a little funky. It could be right. You may have intentionally not reported instructional time on this particular kiddo's course. Okay, but take a look, because maybe you needed to, and maybe you need that information for your instructional units report. We've got early childhood errors, an example being 455, a PK grade student not reported with either early childhood program or a special education program record. And that kind of leads me into the SPED errors. There's a lot of SPED errors. And again, I'm going to highlight how important it is that we're capturing and fixing this information now versus waiting, or if it gets too late and then we can't make the change. Both state and feds utilize this information to do the reporting. And sometimes, like the feds won't even accept the data if it's not accurate. So it's just so important to be reviewing those errors in that data. Attendance data, say perhaps error 735, you have no absences reported at a school. So you have a whole school that has perfect attendance, sounds kind of crazy, but maybe you do. That one's particularly a warning. So it's not an error, you don't have to fix it, but it's saying data looks funky, take a look. We've got some grad cohort errors and then some discipline errors as well that you should be reviewing as part of your year-end data. So this particular discipline one is saying the discipline length is missing for a suspension or expulsion. So if for some reason you're reviewing your errors and you can't click through them, potentially you're missing some security level access as relates to the portal and your advisor validation collection. So talk to your portal district administrator, and they may need to give you some additional activation codes. If you're still struggling, submit a ticket to the service desk and we can help figure out what's going on there. I did put a link in here as well to our help site, and we have a few, and I say a few because we don't have all the errors documented, but we have a few errors documented where it talks about how you can fix those and goes into a little bit greater detail to help you with that. So that can be useful. Once you've reviewed your errors and your warnings, what's next? Well, maybe as you're reviewing your errors and warnings, you have some questions and you're not quite sure. Now, why is this error showing up? I don't understand. It's in my student information system correctly. Why is the advisor saying there's an error? Use your lookups. They're a really super helpful tool to research these errors and warnings. Example, enrollment lookup by ID, student lookup by ID. The service desk uses these a lot. The enrollment can be helpful because you can see multiple school districts. Let's say a kiddo has transferred a lot over a couple of years. You can see all of those years of data for one kiddo. And then the student lookup by ID is really helpful if you're trying to figure out why one kiddo is showing up in this particular error. It shows you everything reported about that kiddo for this school year. So that can be really helpful. There's student lookup by demographics if you want to look up specific to one of the demographic data points. There's a SPED lookup, especially helpful for a lot of your SPED data. And then there's some various other programs lookups for career ed, early childhood, homeless, and Rural 18 data. All right, so you've used your lookups, you've gone through your errors, warnings, you're feeling pretty good about everything. Next step in the process is to review your verification reports. So we've got a really helpful Excel file here at this link at the very bottom of the page that tells you which reports to review during each collection window. So right now we're focused on year end, but that Excel file also has data that talks about fall and the follow-up collection. So you can utilize it for that, but we really want to focus on year end reports. When you're looking at your reports, there's different reporting windows frequently within each report, and that helps you kind of filter the data into a specific window. So we'll talk through some of these reporting windows. You've got full year. So this report will display students that are enrolled in your district at any time throughout the school year, even if they're already exited. So that can be helpful if you want a big picture. You've got as of today. So what's interesting about this one is you could run a report right now today, and the second you report your completers and you run this report after that, they may not show up because you've exited them. So it's an interesting way to look at data too. As of October 1st, this has to do with a membership count date. This is live data. So let's say, and I'll go to the next slide here, the reason I say that, because we also have an as of October 1st locked window. So this is the data you submitted in the fall that talks about that October 1st membership count date. We locked it. We locked it down. That's what we use for state aid, all these different reports. The as of October 1st unlocked is your live data. So you can still make changes to that data, but it's not going to show up in the locked report. It's just going to show up in your live data. So you can kind of look at the two different things. The same philosophy is for your end of year reports. So starting earlier this month, any reports that had that end of year window is going to display those. So these are the kiddos who are enrolled at the end of the year. And this is the data that's going to be locked on or around June 30th, that deadline. So once this locked reports are ready in July, you'll be able to see the data that was locked at the end of the year. One of the things a lot of school districts and student information system consortium support folks have mentioned is that it's helpful if you're one person doing all of these reports to print them out or send them in a PDF to the folks who actually know and live in this data every day and have them sign off and say, here's the report. I sent it to you on this date. You signed off. Yay, perfect. That way you can kind of calculate out of all these reports you have to look at. It's a good way to kind of manage and organize those if you have multiple people reviewing the data for the end of the year. All right, last step, at the very end of June, your district administrator, your superintendent typically, is going to approve the year-end collection. So you've reviewed your errors, you've reviewed your reports, signed off on them, then your district administrator is going to log into advisor validation and they're going to approve the 22-23 year-end collection. I've linked some instructions here if they're a first-time superintendent and they might need some assistance, even if they're a returning superintendent. They only do this a couple times a year, so they may need a little guidance. But I think what's important to note is that we don't open this approval until a few days before the audit window is closed, because the expectation isn't that the superintendent is approving the data on June 15th, because we've still got a couple weeks after that time where the NDE is looking at the data, other school districts might be changing some of their data. So we expect some ebbs and flows of the data between that window. So we're not going to open up approval until like the very end of the month. And that's when your superintendent is going to go in and approve the collection. All right, so a few other reminders as you're reviewing your year-end 22-23 data. Focus on those kiddos that are coming back next year. Maybe they're not graduating, but they are in high school. Those kiddos still receiving services who are 18 through 21. Who are they? Make sure that their enrollments are not exited, that their SPED records are still open so they can be served next year. We don't want to exit those. And kind of next point, emphasizing the kiddos who are exiting from SPED. Who are they? Did they transfer out? Making sure their enrollment and their SPED data matches and it exit out prior to next fall. So a helpful hint from your student information systems, run those reports for your full year attendance data now, because when your audit occurs next fall, that information is not updatable anymore. So it's really important to look at it now while you can make changes and review it. And then last but not least, a reminder to just kind of review your exempt student list. There's a collection in the portal called Exempt School Report. Just make sure that you're verifying these students who have to reapply every year are still kind of matching in those scenarios so you can keep track of those kiddos. All right, so now switching gears a little bit. Still talking about 22-23, but the things that have updated this year, the things that are different year over year that we want to make note of. I'm going to go back to staff reporting. We had 2 new position assignment codes this year, one for substitute teachers, that's our 5190, and one for the activities athletic coaches. So the subs, we used to collect that in the CDC in previous years. So you've submitted it before. Now it just looks a little different because you're doing it in staff reporting. So that CDC collection's gone and you're reporting your subs and their days worked in staff reporting. The activities athletic coach, that's a new position. It's never been collected. So you probably have some questions about it. Take a look at the FAQs in the staff manual because it has some really good answers in there. If your question's still not answered, send us a ticket. We'll be sure to look into what data you report. We did have one position assignment code that was renamed, the instructional support paraprofessional, but there wasn't a ton of other changes to staff reporting this year. The last thing, though, to also notice, because we had those new position assignment codes, there's a couple new errors in NSSRS validation related to those. So once you've got your data in staff reporting updated, make sure it'll go into the secondary collection NSSRS validation and review those errors because there could be some new ones that popped up. If you looked at your errors earlier in the year, they may have been one way, but we added these midway through the year, so you may see some additional ones. All right. So then the updates for 22-23 advisor that are specific to advisor validation. We had a couple new data elements, and I'll talk about these a little bit, but Max has been talking about these for a long time every month at our data webinars. So a lot of this information has been talked about before, and we have resources, and I'll get to some of those resources later, but I just want to make sure that we note that. So one of the new data elements was attempt status. So that's that indication of the student's completion regarding that course, that fail, incomplete, withdrawal. And this is required for grades 9 through 12. if applicable, right? If they're blank, we're going to assume that they passed, no problem. So these are the various codes that are part of this data element. The other big one, the new data element, is this instructional time plan. So this is the planned total number of instruction minutes for this course offering. Grades 9 through 12 again. Your calculation of 900 minutes equals 1 IU. We talked a little bit about this new warning that exists. I linked in here a presentation that Max did. It looks like this was back in last month in April. I might add another link here to today's presentation Max did, because he had some additional really helpful stuff for that particular report. We had a new behavior data element, and then we updated some other data elements, the bullying and restraint, as related to LB 154. Again, Max has talked about this. We've got some previous presentations, even last year, so 2022, I have a link here. So if you want to go in and get a little more detail about that, you can review those. And I did put a link here for LB 154 as well, if you have questions about that particular ruling. So then with some of these new data elements, we have some new student verification reports. There's our instructional unit subject area totals. That's a big one. Lots of questions about that one. Teachers properly endorsed percentage. Max just spent a lot of time going through that one. And then the instructional time plan and this attempt status have been added to a bunch of course reports. So you have a way to kind of view and analyze the data that's going into some of these calculations, right? So you can look at your course data to see, okay, did I mark this kiddo's attempt status correctly or not? So now, shifting gears again, this is our last time, we're going to talk about what's coming in 23-24. So we have posted the course codes and clearing endorsements for 23-24. So you can view those now at the course code site. Lots of changes. So I think it's going to be important that you review that changes tab. We had a bunch of fine arts changes, and we even had Cody come and do a presentation in April about that. There's been a lot of name and descriptor changes, many new course codes to add for 23-24, and then some endorsement updates. So I think it was kind of a record year for how many changes that we managed. So I think it's important to review that as you go into your planning for 23-24. We will have our follow-up collection that's due September 15th with an audit window through 10/12. That's your collection where you're able to make changes to your end data. Not that we don't want you reporting everything correctly now. It's just an opportunity to make updates if you need. And then the advisor fall collection, which is due October 15th with an audit window through 10/31. Some of the new data elements, again, that Max has been talking about for several months that are for 23-24 are the IEP, IFSP begin date. So that's the effective date of the kiddo's current IEP or IFSP. There's some optional reporting of some additional disabilities within a single record, which has resulted in a new data element called disability order. So the disability data element is going to stay the same. All those listed stay the same. But now we've got the disability order, which allows you to kind of indicate the order of the records and allows you to indicate multiple disabilities if necessary. Then we've got Part C to B transition delay reason. So this is a brand new element where you can report why the kiddo who's reached their 3rd birthday is continuing to be served in Part C versus B. Parent refused consent, parent chose to remain, other. So there's an opportunity for that too. And then last but not least, an updated data element is our language instruction. And we actually got rid of the code other. So you have to be specific with these options of how you're going to report the methods used to provide English language services to your kiddos who are in that program. Okay, additional information regarding any new changes to 23-24 will be in our advisor data elements guidance. So that's coming soon for next year. And we'll be sure to get that posted to our advisor resources page. Speaking of, here's a bunch of resources. 1, service desk, email us anytime you have any question. Please send us an email and let us help you if we can. We've got the NDE bulletin. This is a great place for up-to-date notifications. I mentioned one of the ones that accreditation sent just recently. We've got the monthly data webinars, again, talking about how Max has done a lot of this stuff and presented a lot of this stuff to us already. So it's important to kind of stay in touch with those. And we do post the PDFs and recordings of previous presentations. So you can, even if you can't make it that day, you can watch it a couple days after if you want. And you can download the PDF to have it on your files. The help site where we have some errors listed. We also list the workday schedule there. So I mentioned there's 3 work days where this presentation is going to be displayed at, and we are asking for optional registration so we have an idea of a head count of who's coming. So you can click through this link and register there. And then last but not least, our advisor resources page. So this is the page where we'll post our 23-24 data elements document and anything else specific to advisor resources. Who reports what, when dropouts guidance. There's a bunch of really helpful things at that website. All right, so now let me look at my questions here.